Welcome back to our podcast, episode 100. I'm EP, and joining me today is Ben, Jonas, Macy, and Izzy. Izzy's not here today, so Macy will be reading her lines. Our topic for today is the Holocaust and the censoring surrounding tragic events like this. We were given a variety of questions from our viewers on topics they want us to cover in this episode. I'll be asking these questions to those joining us today, and they'll give us their honest opinions. Now, without further ado, let's get started. Our first question is it wrong to censor an artist's understanding of events like the Holocaust? Let's start with Jonas.
In my opinion, I feel like it is wrong to censor an artist's opinion. However, I do feel like there's some options that should be censored if they have crossed a boundary that should not be crossed. For example, hate speech. You can't just go out in public and say derogatory terms without repercussions. So why do you think it'll be okay to do this like in a film or a music? And I have noticed lately that a lot of artists are going out and saying some of the craziest things, which is all good, but they need to keep in mind that some people might find it offensive.
I believe it is wrong to censor an artist's articulation of events, even if what they believe or say is seen as unacceptable to society. As long as the artist or person creating the work does not incite violence or against someone or something, they should be free to express their opinion. Being able to disagree with someone's opinion while having a productive conversation is vital to changing the way someone thinks about a certain topic.
I'm a big advocate for freedom of speech, even if it is controversial. That being said, I do think that there should be limits on things that are able to be said. Things like hate speech should be censored as more harmful rather than educational. I think that being able to express your opinion is very important and it opens doors for conversation and change. Events should be portrayed how they were, not as something glamorized or blatantly biased. For the Holocaust specifically, I don't believe there should be movies sympathizing with Nazis for obvious reasons. They were known for their hate speech, and promoting sympathies for Nazis can lead to more hate being spread, plus it's disrespectful to the victims of the Holocaust. Media should be portrayed however the artist wants, but the artist must keep in mind the effect it will have on the victims and population viewing it in general.
I completely agree. Regardless of the contents of one's belief, I think it's extremely important for everyone to be able to speak freely about how they feel on certain topics, regardless of how extreme or incorrect they may be perceived by others. But just like Jonas said, if someone's opinion were to be offensive or harm someone in any way, that's where a problem arises, and censoring of some sort might be necessary to establish respect. And Izzy said, I agree that artists' articulation of events should not be censored to a certain extent. It is definitely important to allow victims to share their stories and raise awareness of the things that they have been through. However, in some situations it may be necessary in some circumstances, such as when speaking in detail about experiences that may have been triggering to some who are survivors of the event, or around children who may not be old enough to understand the event and its implications. This may depend on the situation. For example, if we are talking about a movie or in a book, in which the audience can adequately prepare themselves for the content they will be learning about by looking up trigger warnings or age recommendations, there would be less need to censor the work, whereas if the artist was given a speech or demonstration in public, such as Deborah Lipstadt's lecture in the movie Denial, they should censor some of the details that may be too graphic or too mature for some audiences.
On to the next question. Is it only acceptable to portray such events when actual survivors are involved in the process? Let's start with Macy this time.
I don't think a survivor being involved is the only acceptable option. I think it completely depends on the topic at hand. In this case, while we're discussing the Holocaust, I think it's a great idea for survivors to be involved, since this is a rare occasion where such a large tragedy still has remaining survivors. Then again, I don't think the presence of survivors is completely necessary. Though I think it would, of course, be extremely useful in order to get an actual hands-on account of what truly went down during the Holocaust or any other historical event. For example, in the film Denial, the main protagonist wanted to include Holocaust survivors in her case while in court. Though after discussing with her legal team, they decided it wouldn't be the best idea, considering the reputation of the man that they were in court against. They knew that if they were to put a survivor on the stand, that they would be torn apart by the other team. So in this case, it was smartest to avoid involving survivors for a very understandable reason. The case was still strong without a survivor's point of view, which ties back into what I said originally. I think it completely depends on the topic at hand, but I don't think portraying events without actual survivors present is unacceptable, because it can still be completely valid.
I agree with Macy. I think it really depends on the situation. For the Holocaust, it's definitely important to research the events and get an account of what happened from the survivors, though there aren't many survivors today, so it's definitely difficult to get a survivor involved. I think as long as you've done your research and taken into account what the victim has said, I don't see a problem with not including survivors in the process. It becomes a problem when the artist deliberately ignores the thought of the audience and those who have survived in order to portray something that is inherently incorrect. An example of this is from the film The Boy in the Striped Pajamas. Viewers often hold the idea that Bruno shouldn't have died there, when in reality, no one should have died there. Shmuel's character doesn't engage with the reader's sympathy, rather, Bruno gains the sympathy. I'm not saying that Bruno doesn't deserve sympathy, I'm saying that the focus shouldn't be on how Bruno's family suffered, but rather on the sufferings of the Holocaust victims as a whole.
Like EP and Macy said, it really depends on the situation. What you have to remember here is that these are people's stories that you're portraying, so it's extremely important to tell it right. I do believe in order to portray the story, you need to do it through research and credible sources, because if you depict an event in an unrealistic way, some people might be very offended.
Izzy said, I think that if it is possible to include survivors in the process, the creators should do their absolute best to do so. While having a first-hand account of the event is the best way to ensure credibility, we also have to recognize that there are many important events that there are no longer any survivors left to tell that first-hand account, and I don't believe this should stop us from remembering these events and portraying them in the media.
I don't believe it is only acceptable to portray events when the actual survivors are involved in the process. I believe creating a piece of art that portrays an actual survivor creates more meaning to the person who's looking at it. Because if you were someone who's learning about someone's life in the Holocaust and then you can connect that to a piece of art, it would have a much greater effect on that person. It should not be a factor when creating art to something like the Holocaust, because for one reason, there are not many remaining survivors, which can make it difficult to create a piece based on someone's life. You could also look up information about someone's life through published diaries or an interview through their first-hand experience. And even if a piece of art does not have an actual depiction of someone who experienced the Holocaust, the message can be the same but have a little bit less meaning than it could. It is okay for a filmmaker to bring... Is that a different one?
So our next question, is it okay for a filmmaker to bring to life the story of someone's life as long as it is accurate depiction of their life and doesn't add elements to the film that are false or put in to change aspects of someone's life, specifically to make the movie enjoyable for a viewer?
A benefit of making a story on paper and converting it to the silver screen is it allows all types of audience to learn about the event that happened. A movie to most is much more preferable than reading a book or paper, and by taking advantage of this, you can teach a whole wide audience about history in an enjoyable way. A movie that participates in this is Denial, which is a movie about a lawsuit between a Holocaust denier and a Holocaust historian, where the Holocaust was essentially put on trial. It showed accurate events of the lawsuit with some parts added in for the benefits of the audience, but it did keep the main idea of what occurred in real life.
I don't see a problem with films being used to portray a real story, as most people would rather watch a movie than read a book. It's a way to spread information easier and to get more people to really understand what happens, as they physically have to see it happen. It becomes a problem when the film strays far from the original media was, and it's when used for monetary gain. A really good portrayal of this was the movie The Pianist. It stayed true to its original form, as it was based on a real-life story/diary of a Jewish man. It showed the horrors of the Holocaust without being censored. It was gritty and gruesome, but it really got the point across to the watchers.
I completely agree with EP. Movies are so much more common these days, so I actually think they are an excellent way to get ideas and concepts across when it comes to topics that would otherwise be difficult to truly grasp. Many people find it easier to grasp something when they can experience it visually like me. I find it difficult to simply read something about a historical event and understand it completely. I think as long as a film accurately portrays whatever they're discussing, there is no problem with the production of said film, especially when awareness can come from it. And Izzy said, I agree that it's okay to bring these stories to life, as it will help raise awareness to these events on a larger scale, like Ben and EP mentioned. Sticking as closely to the survivor story as possible is a crucial part of this. Filmmakers can do this by consulting with the survivor through the creative process to ensure that they do not feel the details are being twisted or glamorized. If they have the approval of the finished product of the survivor story that they are telling, then I do not see why there is any reason to be against publishing a film based on their experiences.
Like the others said, I think it's okay with films to be using, I think it's okay for films to be used to portray a real story, mainly because it attracts a younger audience, and I think that any younger person would much rather would watch a movie than read a book, especially me. But I do believe that you have to keep it mainly to the original material, but not make it stray so far off to where it creates its own story.
Our final question for this podcast is, how should we compare these films to documentaries made for educational purposes? And do you believe that the Hollywood films about genocide are for educational purposes or only for entertainment?
Izzy said it is difficult to make generalizations about all Hollywood films as they can fall in different parts of the spectrum. I would say that there is intent to educate audiences in the vast majority of these films, though there are varying levels of exaggeration of details and fictional aspects in different Hollywood films. The Boy in the Striped Pajamas definitely falls on the entertainment end of the spectrum, as the setting of the film as well as the experience of Shmuel in the camp were unrealistic. Creating these films to entertain is not necessarily a bad thing, as it can bring in a larger audience of people who wouldn't necessarily be interested in watching a documentary. But it becomes a problem when the film distorts facts and glamorizes the experience of these victims.
For me, this question depends on the film. Films like The Pianist were used for educational purposes, while the film The Boy in the Striped Pajamas was used more for entertainment. Films are usually purposed for entertainment, so it can be entertaining while also being educational. Documentaries are only really focused on being educational. The film Denial is a good balance between entertainment and education. It has suspense and tension while also teaching those about a real scenario that happened. Documentaries hold more truth than films do, so in the end, I think it's important to know and understand what parts of the film are for entertainment and what parts are true.
I agree with the idea that it depends on the film itself, because I said in the film Denial, it did have a balance between education and entertainment, which made it a good movie for an audience to see. Although some films that are created have more historical information in them, they rely heavily on fiction to keep the movie going. Like a movie The Boy in the Striped Pajamas, which consisted of events that did not happen and were just historically inaccurate. While movies can be educational and entertaining, documentaries are built on accurate historical information. To some, documentaries may be boring and long, but it's because they don't rely on Hollywood entertainment to create a fun story for their audience. They are built on facts to show an audience an accurate portrayal of an event.
I also agree that it depends on the film. Some films can be both entertaining and factual, and some films can just be used for entertainment purposes and have no factual information whatsoever. The thing is, though, you can't advertise that movie by saying that it's based on real events. Movies like The Denial and The Pianist can say these because there are documents that prove that this event has happened. But movies like The Boy in Striped Pajamas can't, because because there's little factual information in the movie.
I agree with what everyone else said. It completely depends on the film. Like Izzy mentioned, The Boy in the Striped Pajamas was definitely more for entertainment, while Denial was a great balance between historical accuracy and entertainment. Though I do think documentary is ideal when trying to truly grasp such a complex event like the Holocaust, some Hollywood films do incorporate simply inaccurate information in order to make their films more appealing, which I think is completely wrong, and can easily spread false information. For example, like Jonas said, there were events shown in The Boy in the Striped Pajamas that did not happen, and if I hadn't looked into the accuracy of the film, I likely would have just assumed they did happen. Overall, I think Hollywood films have the potential to be accurate and entertaining at the same time, as long as no one goes overboard and intentionally adds false information or alters any information in any attempt to try to make their movie more appealing.
And with that, we wrap up our podcast. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.